Okay, so I'm doing this live more because I'm already still awake and got a lot of different things on my mind that have kept me awake, but that's not what this is about. This is more or less for people that want to catch it on the replay. I figured most people wouldn't be up for this because it's late, well, early rather, but yeah, I was basically just doing this to talk about the reason why I do what I do as far as compiling research and using it to create presentations for people. I don't just do this just to do it. I do this because I actually give a shit about what happens to people, and there's a lot of things going on in the world, and I think that, again, as I've always said in all my lives, I think that people are not seeing the forest from the single trees because people are getting caught up on a lot of things that are going on right now, like the whole stuff that's going on in the background, like the Roe v. Wade, all the stuff that's made to be agitation propaganda and cause the internal conflict. You see, there's two sets of elites, as I've always explained and I've always maintained. There's two sets of elites. There's the Western satanic banking elites, as everybody knows, and everybody's hooked on because everybody always talks about them. But what they forget is there's also the Eastern elites, too. There's not just one set of elites. They're like rival mafia syndicates. They're like rival mafia cartels. They have their own agendas that are different from one another. You see, one wants to tear its own power base down, the West, namely, because it only controls the West. It doesn't control the entire world, contrary to popular belief. You see, the Eastern elites are your CCP regime of China, who are not part of the West. They're not integrated with the West. They could give a rat's ass about the West, and same with Russia. The West is livid with Russia because the sanctions backfired. Russia is not in the Western camp. And I've explained this diligently, deeply, many, many, many times about China and Russia, and also India. They're trying to keep India they're trying to woo them, rather, into the Western camp, but it's not working because Modi has told the likes of woke Lloyd Austin to kick rocks. Hey, Oki. Hey, Miriam. Good to see you all. I'm glad you all came. This is just something I'm doing just off the cuff because I'm already awake still. I've had a lot on my mind. I had a pretty shitty night, but that's personal stuff. It has nothing to do with this. But yeah, the Eastern and Western elites are two separate sets of elites. And people are hung up on the bottom rungs of everything, meaning that people are looking at like these singular events and making a big thing of it. But really and truly, they all fit into the same dynamic. And that dynamic is to agitate, inflame, divide, distract, and cause internal conflict, internal strife. And the reason why I do my documentary presentations is because I'm literally taking the same patterns of things that have happened around the world, and especially Syria, because I see America breaking into different factions, just like Syria. And there's even aspects of Yugoslavia sprinkled into it. Like you might have Texas or some of the bigger states that are economically bigger and more self-sufficient. You might have them leave altogether. Like I put in my scenario, it was Texas and Florida that left. Now, that was an aspect of a Yugoslavian breakup civil war. Now, I've also made the different factions, like in Syria. I showed a little demonstration earlier for those who've seen it. It was the ground combat in the city of Aleppo, Syria. It was very intense combat, but I picked that video because there's no dead bodies. I didn't want to freak anybody out. It was just the raw combat. At the very beginning, some sort of a massive munition goes off. It could have been like a suicide truck or something like that. It was like the perfect rendition of the type of combat that would occur in my scenario, in my hypothetical scenario. So I picked that video because it had aspects of everything in it. It had four different factions. One was wearing red headbands, the other yellow, and one white. and I think I saw some blue headband in there because you had Al Nusra Front, which was a faction, fighting against Al Sharam, which was a faction. Then you also figured in the regime fighting the Free Syrian Army. It was like a four-way battle in that big city. Aleppo was a big city. It was like a 2.5 million population city, and it had this humongous battle taking place inside of it. Now, America being a much, much, much bigger nation, you'd have much, much more territory to cover, as I've shown in my documentaries. And I've also made some like combat battle renditions, sort of like how I drew conceptual artwork for the leaders. What I also did was that I actually made like little battle scenes that showed like different aspects of the combat itself. Like I had an artillery piece firing. I had the Mormon State militants loading up a tractor trailer full of artillery shells from the Thule Army Depot and wiring them all up to blow, like turning it into a giant suicide vehicle. And, I had a bunch of stuff like that I drew. And also I had the death squads of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. I put them in there too, and they were like chopping off limbs and setting people on fire and things like that, and they had a mass grave in the background. I didn't show any real graphic stuff. I just showed that they were about to do those things. Because I'm not trying to scare people with this stuff. I do these presentations to alert people to the realities and the horrors of warfare, because people don't understand. And especially in the West, in Western nations, they don't understand the severity and how serious this all is. People think it's like a video game or a movie, and it's nothing like it. There's no movie, there's no video game, there's no freaking comic book that can do warfare any sort of justice at all. By that I mean there's no like rendition of it that would be adequate or accurate, unless you were actually a witness to or a participant thereof inside of it. So, again, I wanted to do all this to teach people how to navigate, because people need to understand how to survive these things, how to navigate these things. It's very, very critical. We're in a dire state here. We're in a position to where some really, really hardcore things are about to happen that people just aren't ready for at all. I want people to survive this stuff. And that's just the internal conflict I'm talking about. I haven't even mentioned the foreign invasion yet. That's a whole other deal. And I've already showed everybody in great detail in my work as far as the Chinese and Russian invasion. I've shown every detail, the logistics of it, and the massive, gargantuan logistics that allowed for such a thing to take place in the first place. I showed how the hybrid warfare, the fourth generation warfare doctrines of China and Russia worked, to where they infiltrated the country, they subverted it, they bought a bunch of properties, and then they stationed all their CCP regime soldiers and paramilitary, their PLA and PAP and like forces, even their national militia troops, which were like their paramilitary version of the National Guard in China. They had them, the Russian army. Everybody was on CCP regime properties inside the United States. They all materialized all throughout the country in my documentary series. And of course, I had the maps of it. I'm kind of tired, so bear with me, but this is very important. I made all of this so that people can get an idea of why I even do all this. I don't, sometimes I ask myself, I'm like, Chad, why do I even bother with any of this shit? Do people even watch this or pay attention? Do people even care about their own life, trying to make it? I can't help but ask, I have to ask that, because I put a lot of work into this. I put days worth of work into this. If people understood all the time it took to make maps and to draw the conceptual artwork, to actually compile research and put it into writing, write stories, basically, that are like mini novels. I took up an entire composition book to write just the first part, which took like 2.5 hours to read. That took me several days to write that, because I had to take breaks. It was a lot of writing. Then the maps I had to figure out the most logical places where battles would occur, like as far as like strategy is concerned. I had to create entire factions and what their goals were and everything. I had to compile a lot of stuff. It wasn't easy. It took a lot of time to do this. I don't think people understand that this is a lot of actual, like, tedious type of work. I mean, they're fun to do, as like once I actually have it finished, it's actually quite fun to actually do, but as a presentation, but I try to make it as professional as I can. Now, this is like low budget history channel. The Chad Carr channel is the low budget history channel. Hey, Armored Saint. Hey, I'm glad to see you too, buddy. Yeah. My channel's like the low budget history channel for people that want to learn. You know, that's what this is about. This is about learning. This is about learning so that you can better your situation. Now, here is the whole entire scenario script. The whole thing was an entire composition book, even on the back. Like that was just for the first part. But here's my invasion maps from the foreign invasion. Now, remember, all the units that are circled, like this Chinese group army, which one is this? This is the 8th group army. They all materialized on CCP properties inside the country. Same with this unit here. So all around Seattle, Bellevue, and Tacoma, all the properties in this area where the units materialized. That's where they were. They were all over. Same with this, like, North Korean, whatever down here, this North Korean Corps, the 2nd Corps of the Korean People's Army. It materialized here in Wyoming. Then you had the 7th Group Army materializing here. Then you had the 75th Militia Corps of China, which was like their paramilitary National Guard militia corps here. One of them, one of many. And then you had more up here. You had their prongs of attack from the externals. When I try to teach people the difference between externals and Trojans, the Trojans are the foreigners living here among us. When they get their muster signal, they race to their CCP properties where their vehicles and logistics that they built up over 20 plus years of living here and building up their stuff, because they owned American ports and properties. Never ever forget that. They built up here forever. Like, well, I mean, what? Not forever. It's late, guys, so cut me some slack. I'm just chilling. I'm just doing this casually. They built up here for many years. That's the point. And in Canada, they have legal bases in Canada, like Salt Spring Island. I've shown you guys Salt Spring Island, okay? In real life, where they're marching and doing all that. We know that they train. They have PLAAF bases up there too, because they fly regularly over London, Ontario. That's where they train, the PLA fighter jets that are inside Canada already at PLAAF bases. Their armies there, their PLA, their PAP is there, People Armed Police. Their Navy is all up and down the Canadian coast here. They have bases here, okay? In real life, in real life. That's why I made these maps. Like, we already know that they've been coming across the border, both borders. They've infiltrated with student visas. They've done all that. And as they've been living among us, there is going to come a time where they're going to get their muster signal and go from their to their CCP properties and start getting their vehicles all revved up and maintained, you know, their pre-maintenance services and checks with their POL products, their fuel. They're going to load up their ammo, and they're going to go out and do their missions. That's how this works. And as they're doing that, then the externals in Mexico and Canada, they race deep inland, spread out to help the Trojans already doing the heavy lifting. That is hybrid warfare. That is hybrid warfare. That's what it's called. That's what it is. That's how they do it. And then you might have your coastal landings, and then you have your Chi-Com and Russian air forces flying through both ends. That's how hybrid warfare works. That's why I've done all this, to show people, to educate people, so that they know what to even do. You know, when this stuff happens, this is real shit. You know, I mean, this ain't no joke. And I know I'm sort of animated. That's because I'm being casual with you guys. I'm just being myself. Like, I'm not trying to, you know, be all, you know, uptight and doing my little show. When I did this here, this is the factions for the internal conflict. You see, they're all color-coded here. This is the territories that they started on and seized. Now, nominally, when the Civil War began, before the foreign invasion, here's what happened. Like, when the Civil War began, we already know the regime already has controls. But then in the power vacuum that occurred because of riots and civil unrest everywhere, you had all your loonies and crazies that had been hiding in the shadows and waiting for their chance, they came out and seized power. The Free American Army had a coup. They had a coup in D.C., which I read in the second part of the documentary. I've put all these videos into a playlist, so they're all going to be there. By the time I finish my actual whole entire documentary series, and I plan to do the third video tomorrow, the battle video, I already did the second part that had the coup happening. Then when the coup failed, the coup plotting forces all retreated to other friendly areas where other friendly forces were waiting. Now remember, in Fort Bragg was the headquarters of General Mathis and his forces, because he is the head of the entire Army Reserve. So his headquarters is actually in Fort Bragg, because that's where the Army Reserve headquarters is. So that's how he seized power. Even though the coup failed, he started his Free American Army. So then you had the National Salvation Revolutionary Front. They had their own little coup, but they took over Lincoln, Nebraska, turned that into their capital, and immediately the quest for weapons of mass destruction for that faction began. Now, can you imagine in an American collapse, you have all these factions scurrying and trying to grab hold of VX nerve gas, sarin, nukes, very, very dangerous things. You have all these factions scrambling to acquire weapons of mass destruction. They're literally raiding armories. They're taking over. That could happen very, very, very easily. Because in a nation of 340 million people, you really don't know who's waiting in the shadows, who's waiting in the wings for their opportunity. Now, you see all these wokesters out there making all this noise, but they're not the real danger. The real danger is the people that are quietly sitting back and watching everything. Can you imagine even if in a country of 340 million, even if only 4% or 5% of the population participated in a conflict, do you even understand how many people that is out of 340 million? Even if there were just 100,000 kooky Mormon state people that were like McVeigh and they drove humongous truck munitions into places, even 100,000 of people like that could cause immense damage and destruction. Just 100,000. And that's 1/10 of a million. And if there was 10 or 14 million combatants throughout the entire conflict, even just 100,000 could cause immense damage and just utterly turn cities and areas to rubble. Like in my battle between the Mormon State and the National Salvation Revolutionary Front here in Cheyenne, they had a apocalyptic battle that led to their truce in my documentary scenario. And they led to the truce because they were both scrambling to get the nukes at Warren. Now, when the coup happened and they took over, when the coup happened in D.C. with the Free American Army, and while they were distracted, Florida declared independence, Texas declared independence, they took over the church, the Mormons. Then you had these guys rise up and battle at Reno and capture Reno. You had these guys doing battle with the local paramilitary forces, basically the alphabet gangsters. And then you had these guys seizing a lot of the country, the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, because their leadership knew a lot of people, meaning that they knew people that knew people that knew people that knew people. Now, it's naive to think or to say that in such a situation, stuff like that couldn't happen. That's very naive thinking. If you think that there's not connected people out there that know different other types of groups and everybody that would click up together, that's naive. It's very naive. So what I'm saying is, in them trying to get their Great Reset, they're biting off a lot more than they can chew. And I'm talking about the regime and the globalists, because they're already going to lose their grip on power the moment they really start pushing. Because you have this whole huge, vast nation full of 340 million people. And even, like I said, it doesn't even take them all being combatants for such a scenario to really happen. Even if there's only 10 million of them, then you already have a situation on your hand. Even 10 or 14 or 15 million combatants in a civil war, you have a massive situation on your hands. Because you have to understand, the logistics would be so complicated in such a conflict, because if America collapsed, the money collapsed, everything collapsed, you're going to be in a situation to where resources like fuel and food and everything else is very limited. So if you're a faction, your ability, even if the National Salvation Revolutionary Front had 5 million total combatants, which they did, that's what I wrote down on my little card. Each faction has a card about their attributes, what they're after, what they believe in, what they're trying to do, what their goals are, what kind of WMDs they've acquired, which, you know, they ended up killing hundreds of thousands with, if not more. You know, like VX and Syrian. Can you imagine America just disintegrating like that, to where every crazy that you can think of gets their hands on weapons of mass destruction? This place would be so dangerous. People, this would be the most dangerous country on earth, because America does have quite a stockpile of chemical weapons as well as nukes. And if the Mormon state, they're a radical cult-like religious kook state that are sort of like the tally to the ban, or the ISIS faction in Syria, if they acquired a nuke and they had the technical experts from, say, Thule Army Depot outside of Salt Lake who work on robotics for Army EOD robots and other types of robots, and they regularly work with munitions when they're either decommissioning them, upgrading them, or testing them, you had them rig up a nuke from Warren, and they got their hands on one, rigged one up, and they sent one to, I don't know, San Diego, and I mean, can you imagine stuff like that happening? In an internal conflict, those things are possible. They're not only possible, I see them really becoming a reality, especially when, like, the NSRF ended up using a lot of chemical weapons in certain battles here with the regime and also with the Free American Army. There was like a three-way battle in Martinsville, Virginia, which is one of the battles. See, again, I tried to make all the key battles where they actually were able to muster a bunch of forces according to their transportation abilities and according to their logistical abilities, because you can't run an army without logistics. If you don't have parts, you don't have POL products, fuel. Like POL products are your lubes and your hydraulic fluids and things like that. If you don't have that stuff for your vehicles and you don't have fuel, guess what? Your army ain't doing a damn thing. They ain't going nowhere. They ain't fighting nobody. So, yeah. Oh, hey, Shadow Mask. Good to see you, bud. Hey, Mary. Unorthodox. Good to see you all. The chat finally appeared. I could see some names. But anyway, if you don't have those things, your army ain't doing nothing. And the regime in this scenario, guess what, you guys? Guess what? You're going to like this. They're already talking about getting rid of 40,000 more troops that won't take the certain thing in their arm. Well, guess what? That would push them to join factions and take everything they have with them in such a scenario in real life. And this is what I'm talking about. This is in real life, where I'm talking about the 40,000 that they're trying to coerce into getting that thing. And they're guards troops, they're guardsmen that wouldn't take it. Because a lot of our guard and reserve troops haven't took the mark yet. So in a scenario, you're going to have regime forces being largely like your active duty military, but then like the Free American Army is going to be mostly reservists and National Guard people in certain areas. And then you have the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, who gets their own guard and reserve forces. A lot of factions. NSRF inherited an air force. Texas inherited an air force. Even they did, but they couldn't. Mormon State couldn't use it very much because they didn't have enough fuel. Our Air Force consumes on average 2.5 billion gallons of fuel a year, and that's just standard operations. That's not during wartime. So here's the deal. When I made my scenario, guess how much oil there is in the country? At the beginning of my scenario, there's only like 840 million barrels, 840 million with an M, million. And that's throughout the whole course of the war. So by the end of the war, they're getting bone dry. They can't use their air forces. They can hardly launch any sort of mechanized assaults or anything like that because they're almost out of fuel at that point. I even broke it up into percentages on who has how much percent of the fuel. I wrote it all down and everything. Look, I really wanted to get into the economic stuff with this. I wanted to show you guys every single conceivable solid angle of it. I want you guys to understand the depths of it so that you understand everything about how armies work. Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there among people, and people believe things about armies that just aren't true. Armies just can't get up and do things. They have to have spare parts. They have to have fluids and hydraulic fluids and oils, lubricants. They have to have fuel. They have to have food. They have to have water. They have to have a way to transport it all. You have to have actual functional troops that can fight worth a damn, that are trained. You can't just have some wokesters and expect them to like perform well in the battlefield. I mean, people that are poorly trained on their certain vehicles and equipment, you're just not going to have that. You can't have a war like that. You could see in an internal conflict, the regime is going to lose a lot of territory really, really fast, just like Bashar al-Assad did in Syria. It's no different. So that's why I modeled this very heavily off of Syria, because this could easily happen here, and I see it happening here, just basically along the lines of how I made the scenario. So people that ask me all the time, like, oh, what do you think's going to happen with this and this? Well, this is what I think's going to happen because this is how I'm making the scenario. You know, I really see it going a lot like this. Sure, there might be different factions with different names than the ones I made up, but it's still the same concepts are there. Factions, multiple factions that take a lot of the armed forces with them, who are sympathetic to them, factions that have different ideologies, different beliefs, factions that are not tied down to any sort of globalist things because they have their own ideas about how they want to do things, factions that have left the old paradigm to create a new paradigm. And by creating a new paradigm, I mean literally new political types of things, like how the NSRF created like their own ultra-nationalist political force. You had Texas becoming its own republic, Florida becoming its own republic. You had the Free American Army trying to make a constitutional government. There's no more Democrat and Republican Party by the time this happens, you guys. That shit's over with. That's over and done. Because by that point, when the internal conflict breaks out and all these hidden factions emerge and start to seize control of like other armed groups to amalgamate them together, what they're going to do is they're going to steer all these groups into their ideologies and their ways of thinking, and people are going to take to it because guess what? Most people want strong leaders, and when they see these factions emerging and they see how strong they are, like the strong men of the Troika, the strong men of the junta for the Free American Army, the strong men of the Supreme Council of Elders for the Mormon State, the strong men of the Texas Republic and the Florida Republic, the interim leaders, when they see new leaders emerge, or Robert Montillier, the leader of the main militia forces, when they see people like that emerging, people are gonna be drawn into that. You can't say that when strong leaders emerge, people aren't going to be drawn into that. It's happened all throughout history, and nothing is special about this country to where that couldn't happen here either. So here's the deal with the fuel. There's 840 million barrels of fuel available during the conflict due to factors such as what remained in every corner of the nation, what limited quantities could even be produced of oil and refined of it, and a very tiny limited amount that came from outside the land, like factions like La Raza narco state could import it from like Venezuela through Mexico or straight from Mexico because they're an oil producing nation. They have Pemex, which is their national oil company. Then a very tiny amount that could come from outside the land, like I said, that come to certain factions, that was attained by various factions via trade, donations, or through a form of lend-lease, like the regime begging for fuel and only being able to get a very little bit through like a lend-lease program from like its foreign, associates. Now I wouldn't even call them allies at that point because the regime has alienated so much of the world. Nobody's going to help them when they're in that situation. They're going to be on their own. Unlike Assad, who had strong allies like Russia, China, Iran, and proxies to help him. And Assad only won his civil war because he was on the ropes. Those factions in Syria, they had Assad on the ropes. Like Assad was about to lose his regime. And these then the Russians, the Iranians, later the Chinese, and the proxies all came in and saved Bashar al-Assad's ass. They pulled his ass out of the fire. and they saved him from being toppled by these factions. Now, if you think that that can't happen here, you know, that's it's just lunacy. It's crazy thinking. You know, I'm trying to warn people about reality and real things. This stuff is realistic as it gets. Okay, it's as real as it gets. So okay. Anyway, the entire USA Armed Forces annually uses the whole armed forces, and not just the Air Force now. The entire USA Armed Forces annually uses 599 million barrels per year. So within the short internal conflict period of hostilities, 840 million barrels were primarily a result of all the aforementioned factors, along with factors, along with factors such as division among the factions, division of the fuel, that is, among the factions, and destroyed refining and transport infrastructure throughout the course of the conflict, which is like your pipelines, your trucks, you know, the truck in the oil, your trains. Trains are a huge part of transporting fuel, as well as pipelines and trucking. And in an internal conflict, you have stuff like that get destroyed. So then how are you going to transport your oil? You know, people aren't thinking about this stuff. This stuff is important. Logistics are everything in a conflict and with armies. People don't understand how armies work. They can't just do things. They have to have methods of transport. They have to have a strong logistical infrastructure. And I've tried to teach everybody that in my foreign invasion scenarios, like my community tab story review playlist, where I wrote those stories in community tab, and I made a review for them for everybody to go to, and I have a whole section about how logistics work in that. So I'm trying to explain it again, but I'm using the internal conflict as a template to explain how logistics affect such a thing. Okay, so you have Texas, who obviously produces the most oil, and that's an actual fact. They do. So in an internal conflict where they leave, you know, they have very minimal damage to oil infrastructure, okay, at the beginning of the conflict. So Texas leaves, and they end up with 185 million barrels out of that 840 that's across the whole nation. They end up with 185 million barrels, which is 22% of all the oil in the conflict, which is the 840 figure. Then you have the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, and they end up with 151 million barrels, which is 18%, because they have the Dakotas, and they're still able to produce some oil in the Dakotas. And that's a primary oil-producing region for the National Salvation Revolutionary Front, just like how Texas produces a bunch of oil, too. Now, you also have the other factions, like the Free American Army. They're able to produce 118 million barrels, which is 14% of all the oil that's available in the country. So they get 14%. National Salvation Revolutionary Front is 18% so far. And Texas is 22%, which leaves smaller percents, of course, for the other factions. Now, the other factions, La Raza Narco State, is 17% at 142 million barrels. But you know what La Raza does? They import their stuff. La Raza imports all their oil from Mexico. So they're able to buy it. They're able to purchase the oil with their narcotic funds and their weapons dealing funds, and they're able to import oil from Mexico, since Mexico's an oil-producing nation. So that's how that faction gets their oil. Then the regime has only 11%, 92 million barrels. Ooh, man, they got to be real sparing with their military activities. They can barely fly any jets on that. They can barely have any offensives. They're mostly on the defensive in this war. They're largely on the defensive. Then you have the Army of the Southeast with 2%, which is 17 million barrels. That's it. That's all it takes. Yeah, exactly, Armored Saint. That's what I'm trying to explain to people here. I tell people it takes a huge logistical train, and now I'm using the oil. So what I'm saying ultimately is imagine for a second that all the oil in the conflict, all the oil that's available in the conflict is only 840 million when the conflict begins. When the conflict starts, it's only 840 million nationwide, and I'm divvying that up between all the factions. That's what I'm explaining here. So with the regime having very small areas that don't have any real oil production, minus a tiny bit in California. That's all the regime has for oil production and refining. But otherwise, they don't control no oil-rich territory. So that's why they only have 11%. So they have to be really sparing with how they fuel certain vehicles. They can barely use their Air Force. They can barely use their mechanized formations that they do have of the active duty military. Because for one thing, some of their heaviest forces still left are in Fort Hood, and I did a battle of Fort Hood now. Yup. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I appreciate you, Armored Saint. That's what I'm trying to appreciate you, man. I do. I appreciate you. I appreciate you very much. Please keep telling them that, because I don't think people understand how armies work. I don't think they realize that you need all these things to even be able to function, to even be able to fly your aircraft or sail most of your ships, unless they're like nuclear powered, or to use your jets, your tanks. You need a massive amount of oil. So for the regime, most of the time they're going to be on the defensive because they don't have that much fuel. And I've explained why. So the Army of the Southeast right here, being that they're a smaller faction of only, at their peak numbers, was 500,000. But because they were a small faction, they didn't have that much oil, they had to be very careful how they deployed their forces. They had a big battle in the city of Macon where they tried to keep the regime from getting the key crossroads of Macon. Macon is a big crossroads. Lots of interstates actually intersect here in Macon. 475, 75, I-16, and there's one other one. Hold on. 75, 475, 16. I can't remember. I wrote it down. It's in the battle. I'll show it when I get my battle maps out. Anyways, yeah, then there's the Union of Southwest Militias. They actually get 4% because they have a teeny tiny bit of oil production in Nevada, and that's all they got. That's all they got. So it's a small 4% at only 17 million barrels. But the good thing about that faction is they mostly rely on technicals. They even pull the artillery that they acquired from their first battle with regime forces in Reno. The ones that had to do a layover, that flew in to try to squash rioting in Vegas, they had to do a layover because they were going to land in Nellis, but Nellis wasn't safe. They were going to land in Nellis, but it wasn't safe, so they had to do a layover at the Reno Municipal. And that's where they ended up getting into a battle with the Union of Southwest Militia Forces. And the Union of Southwest Militias ended up capturing their artillery pieces, most of them intact, which became their artillery forces because you had ex-veterans that were 13 Bravos, which are cannon crew member MOSs. You had combat veterans from Iraq or Afghanistan that were 13 Bravo, artillery cannon crew members, which is what I was. And you had them. Oh, by the way, my thumbnail is a picture of me in Iraq. When I was at the combat outpost, I was at the one that right before I got blown up at the Battle of Samud that I was in. I have my vehicle, too. I have a picture of my vehicle I was blown up in. It was taken by a cell phone camera. We weren't supposed to have those out but at the conflict, but, you know, hey, people don't listen. So I got a good photo of my vehicle that I was blown up in when it was on fire. We all got out alive, but we all got out with bad brain damage and back injuries. We got thrown around and smacked our head, back, and necks on all kinds of metal in those vehicles. I have seizures for life because of it and other neurological damage. But anyway, I'm just glad my brain still functions enough to where I can do these presentations to help people. But yeah, they captured artillery pieces, mostly M198s here. From the Guard, from the Oregon Guard that was being flown down during the very, very initial phases to try to squash the riots in Vegas. But when they stopped, they basically got in the battle with the Union of Southwest Militias, very initial forces where they met them in Reno. And the battle for Reno is where they captured their artillery pieces. So anyway, they ended up with 17 million barrels. Then you had the Northwestern Conservative Army, which was the allies of the Union of Southwest Militias. Now they had very small oil too. Now they only also had 2%, which is only Oh, I'm sorry. Union of Southwest militias had 34 million barrels at 4%. At 2%, it was 17 million barrels for these guys. But they allies, and they tried to coordinate their offensives against the regime together. And sometimes they would fight with the with this faction too, the Free American Army, which I modeled off of the Free Syrian Army. So after the failed coup, they became a faction. The failed coup that happened in the capital that started at the very beginning of my second docu-series. Now, at the very beginning of the second docu-series, the don't I don't want people to get confused because I interjected between the coup that happened in the Capitol. I interjected also the coup that happened in Lincoln, where they took over the state and then they took over much of the central Midwest with the NSRF, and then I went back to the coup here. So anyway, the last forces that I didn't mention yet was, besides Texas, Florida had only how many barrels did they have? Um, how many percent? Hold on, let me find Florida here. I write stuff down crazy. Okay, Florida only had 5%. 42 million barrels is 5% of all the oil that was available in the conflict, throughout the conflict. So you could see most of these factions don't have shit worth of oil. So they can't launch these humongous offensives or mobilize these huge armies and send them into big battles. So much of the fighting is what you call low intensity warfare. Armored Saint, if you're in here, talk to them about low intensity warfare. Explain to them what it is. Tell them how it's like mostly skirmishes, ambushes, planting mines or munitions on roads or whatever you have, or occasional, sporadic assaults with like small unit fighting and things like that. Most of the combat was like sporadic small unit type of engagements, but the big combat was when they did use their oil, their food, their ammunition, and they compiled them into small areas where they had these big showdowns, like in Macon, where it was a three-way battle, sort of like the four-way battle I showed you in Aleppo on that video earlier that I posted as an example of what would happen on the ground here. And in Texas, you had a siege where they used their forces, where Texas got forces that defected from the base, Fort Bliss, and they also had their National Guard and their Air Guard. Some Air Force people defected, and they had huge militias in Texas. And they all surrounded Fort Hood, and they eventually seized it. And they cleared the whole entire state of regime forces before they then focused their efforts on both the Free American Army and also on the Mormon state, because they had an uneasy truce with La Raza, because they wanted La Raza. They allowed La Raza to use El Paso as long as it was peacefully to get their weapons in and stuff. But in return, La Raza was not to ever attack Texas and only focus on the Mormon state, to keep the Mormon state off of Texas's back, because the Mormon state was sending like suicide trucks to attack Texas, and the Union of Southwest militias, the regime here and here. And even up here, they were hitting the Northwest Conservative Army with suicide vehicles and things like that. Really, really dastardly, ugly things to do. They also hit the Free American Army too. But yeah, that's the type of stuff that happens in high intensity and low intensity war. But as you can see, there were only limited battles, and that was due to their lack of fuel and resources that was available. So again, it goes back to all the warnings I've given you about the food and fuel collapse in the United States. I said, once this nation gets drastically low on fuel and food, guess what? When you don't have fuel, you can't produce food, and when you don't have food, you can't feed your troops. When you're really low on food and fuel and water because there's droughts everywhere, guess what? You're going to have people fighting over Okay, sorry about that, everybody. I got cut off. Anyway, when you don't have food and fuel, you don't have water. Thank you, Armored Saint. I appreciate you talking about that. That's great. See, people need to understand these concepts. Type a number one if you can hear me okay, because I had some technical issues. If you can hear me, type. Okay, yeah. Okay, if y'all can hear me, type a number one. I had some technical issues, please. Somebody type a number one if you can hear me. Just the number one. Just type it, somebody. In the chat. Okay, great. Thank you, Okie girl. Yeah, yeah, when you would be hit from outside and inside by the Chinese hybrid warfare doctrines, that would be like late into the internal conflict when we've already battered ourselves down so badly that there's not going to be anybody to resist the Chinese and Russians. They'll have it so easy. See, their objective is to have us so weak, so ripped to shreds that they can basically like walk in here and plant their flag. It'll be so damn easy. But they're not going to do it like that. They're, of course, going to hit us as hard as they can while we're down. It's like kicking somebody while they're down in a fight. That's exactly what China and Russia are going to do to us. They're going to kick us while we're down. They're going to kick the shit out of us. And they're going to basically pound what's left into the dust. America will be in the dustbin of history after its civil war, after a foreign invasion, because it's part of judgment. It's all part of God's judgment on America. Now, I know I talk about a lot of like physical stuff in the physical world, like the wars and everything, but I also have a spiritual component to why I do this. I do this because I want people to survive. This is my kingdom work, okay? God wants me to acquire physical facts that back up prophecy and also prepare people to survive in the judgment that's coming. Because, you know, God's people can survive judgment, but God expects us all to do things. God will meet us halfway, but he expects us to do certain things, which is why he put us here. So if you're going to use your brains and you're willing to learn, and we all have room to learn and grow, if you're willing to use your brains and you're willing to learn and grow, well, guess what then? You know, then you're gonna be better off than the people who didn't, because there's a lot of ignorant people that are gonna be reactionary idiots and do stupid things and end up paying the ultimate price for it because they wanted to be stupid. You know, so that's the reason why I do what I do. I don't want people to get out and get butchered. You know, I mean, I want people to actually make it. You know, so that's the whole objective. And I'm going at the very end of my docu-series, I'm actually going to literally do an entire section about navigating internal conflict. And you can also apply what I taught everybody already about foreign invasions. You can already apply that to a internal conflict. It's the same exact concepts as what I put in my story review playlist. It's literally the same concepts. It's just an internal conflict, and there's a few things that might be a little different, but not by much. Not by enough to where it matters. I mean, you really can already do a lot of that. So, yeah, I'm going to hold on one second. Hold on. I'm going to show everybody something. Might as well show the concept art while it's out. Here's the concept art, everybody. Okay, this is a Mormon State suicide truck. It's an 18-wheeler. It's packed with 155 shells that are all daisy-chained together, meaning they've all got wires protruding from them to a central ignition device. And it's basically in this on the road out here in the desert. You know, you can see okay, here it is. If y'all can see, that's the Mormon State vehicle right there. It's the suicide truck. They have a whole 18-wheeler packed with shells, daisy-chained together. And you also have this technical. I try to show a little bit of everything that would be common in these types of conflicts. Here's a mortar. Here's a mortar and a base plate. This guy's about to drop a mortar in there and lob a mortar. All right, Armored Saint, thank you for coming, brother. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that you came, man, and helped out. Yeah, this is all like regular stuff. You see these people inside this blown out building are all shooting at the other building. And yeah, there's the trucks. You can see trucks. You can see technicals off in the distance that are shooting back. Those are like your Union of Southwest Militia guys against these Mormon State guys. See a Mormon State technical mortar team, guys shooting. There's a suicide truck right there. All right, be blessed, Armored Saint. Thank you, brother. Oh yeah, no problem, Flotilla. Hey, I'm glad you like it. I put a lot of work into this stuff, man. This ain't easy to put these presentations together. I'm doing my third part video today sometime. I'm gonna try and stay awake and do it. I might do it next. I don't know. But here's some more guys inside of a city. You see a knocked out Abrams tank over here, and here's one that's actually shooting. This could be any faction. You could pick any faction for this battle. This is what our cities would look like. See the tank shells going off. See these guys over in this rubble over here shooting, and there's a knocked out tank. Here's a guy shooting a rocket propelled grenade. Abrams, guys hiding out in the rubble shooting back. Stuff blasting. Tank shell blasting. Yeah, zoom in on it. Here's the inside of the building one. Again, I'll just zoom in on it. This guy's shooting an AT-4. This guy right here. An AT-4 is a anti-tank weapon. It's not quite a rocket. It's like a shell. It's like an 84 millimeter shell that has it's like a recoilless anti-tank weapon. Like the old recoilless rifles. When it shoots, it blows out the back, but it's like a one-time use weapon because once it blows out the back and shoots, the tube is useless, so you can just throw it away. But it's like a fire and forget anti-tank weapon. And here's an artillery unit here firing a M198 howitzer here. This is a 155 millimeter towed howitzer. Now this could be any faction, but I made this as the what's it called faction? The Free American Army, and they're firing their howitzer. They have it like behind a sand berm out in the desert. This is at the Battle of Las Vegas and the Hoover Dam, and they're firing their shells. You can see it off in the distance. It had a huge blast here, you know. Yeah, let's zoom in on that. Then over here, this might look familiar, but you could use this. I know that I used this one for the invasion, for the Chinese invasion, where this Chinese armor personnel carrier column was coming down the street. But this could just as easily be used as like another faction versus a faction. Like this could be like, for all it matters, this could be the National Salvation Revolutionary Front using like their Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, and these guys could be like Mormon state militants inside a city, or it could be another faction. See, they got like their hunter killer teams, like with their machine gunner and their RPG guy. Another RPG guy. And of course, here's some National Salvation Revolutionary Front forces. Now this is like one of their little base camps out in the middle of a battlefield. Like this is like the paramilitary Jolly Roger Death Brigades here. And what they're doing to a couple prisoners is they're about to hack the limbs off of this guy at a table. See, these two guys are holding his arm still with the rope that they tied to it. This guy has a pistol to his head. Wait, this guy right here. This guy has a pistol to his head before they're about to chop off his arm with a machete. And they're about to light this guy tied to a stake on fire. And then there's the mass graves in the background. I didn't show anything too graphic. I don't want to scare people. I just want to like show the types of stuff that would happen during a civil war. This stuff is common in like African civil wars and other types. Now this guy, he's about to light this dude on fire. Now, remember when I told you what the enemies of the National Salvation Revolutionary Front are? These guys are ultranationalists, like to the extreme. Like they're so ultranationalist that they became secular humanists. And secular humanism shits on humanity. like the CCP of China and Nazis, and like even ultranationalists can become secular humanists where they worship the state, like the new state that the NSRF wants to build. These are their extremist paramilitary forces. They got their own little flag and emblem and everything, like I showed with their leaders. And this is like a little supply shed here. This is like a little base camp for them. You know those little sheds you can buy at that sit out in front of like furniture stores and other places? That's what this is. They got ammo in there and food and water and all sorts of stuff. This is the table. This guy might have been a regime supporter or a woke person or a Karen or whatever. And these guys decided that this person wasn't worthy to be in the new America. And same with this guy. This guy might have been some sort of official, a regime official, and they're about to light him on fire. They also use hangings and other things, firing squads. It all just depends on the different paramilitary forces. But yeah, these guys are brutal. Like, these guys are the ones that Alfred Matufu is the leader of the Troika. A lot of those guys used to be really pro-American type of militia forces that were like right-wing, and then they clicked up to form the death squads that then became the paramilitary brigades of Alfred Matufu, the head of the Jolly Roger brigades. That's their emblem. That's Alfred Matufu. His parents were two Congolese immigrants that immigrated to America. But he was born here, but he was fascinated with Mobutu Sese and his ultranationalist regime in Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, ultranationalist. And he wants to expel all globalists and all their supporters. And by expel, that means basically execute. And then, we got the other members, too. This is their other partner in crime, the other part of their regime that they made. This is the math professor, and I modeled him. Off of the guy in Cambodia. His name was Doik, and he was the math professor in Cambodia in the Khmer Rouge, who actually ended up becoming a mass murderer. And he ran the prison camps in Cambodia, like S-21, where they butchered people and did gruesome, horrible medical experiments and everything else. Well, that's what this guy does. He's also their economic and logistical leader too, out of the Troika. And then, of course, you have Colonel McGregor. He's sort of like the de facto head of the Troika, even though Alfred Matufu is also the political leader of the Troika. He's the economic leader, but he's sort of like the de facto leader because he basically runs all the military forces besides the paramilitary. Colonel McGregor was an ex-Green Beret. He was an ex-math professor from the University of Iowa. These could be real people, guys. I'm not joking. I make these off of, real people that could exist in our world. They have, these types of tendencies and things and ideas, These could be real people. So this guy was an ex-Green Beret. He recently retired from the military, and he didn't like what was happening to the country, and he wanted to rebuild America in his own way, with his own ideology, and he wanted to get rid of the globalist regime and replace it with a pro-American regime that he took it in a really, really warped, extremist type of direction. They all did, and that's how they ended up becoming mass murderers. And they went for the chemical weapons and nukes because they wanted to do as much damage as they could on the battlefield. So these guys are really extreme. But you also have another extreme faction. Besides the regime and the NSRF and the La Raza narco state, you also have the Mormon state. Here's Josiah. This is Supreme Acolyte Josiah. And this is the Mormon state emblem. Yeah, sorry about that. Dropped it. Anyway, this is the Mormon state emblem. It's a shield with a sword, the Book of Mormon, and the scales. And you can see this is a spiritual thing to them. They're like a cult. They're like an extremist cult, like a religious cult. And what they did is they took over the entire Mormon church.
Even the mainstream church, they got rid of the church president and replaced it with the council of elders. These guys lived in like compounds in like far off parts of Utah, and they formed an extremist militant unit called the Brigham Young Brigade. And they're the ones that took over the church in a church coup. And they preached their extremist rhetoric and sermons, sort of like Mullah Omar in Afghanistan when he created the Taliban, subverted the entire Mormon church to his whims and the Council of Elders' whims, and they were all like they all became his generals because they were like militant Mormons. Well, this means that they're all about beheading anybody that is found wanting, and that's what the scales mean. So spiritually, if people are found wanting, they're beheaded, because the Mormon state is all about converting everybody to their extremist brand of Mormonism. You see, he's got the Book of Mormon, he's got his AK, he's raising up in the air off to the distance. And then you got Acolyte Issachar, who is the guy that organized the Brigham Young Brigade, the combat unit that seized control of the church. If you watched both of my documentary videos, then the whole part about how they took over the Mormon church is in the first part. They had like a shootout in the inside the temple. Josiah and his right-hand man, Acolyte Mordecai, they kicked open the doors and they ended up having a shootout inside the temple with the governors of Utah's security forces, and they overcame them and they took over the Mormon church and the state all in one fell swoop. You have to read that. It's an interesting story. And then you have, of course, you have the right-hand man of Supreme Acolyte Josiah, which is Grand Acolyte Mordecai. He's the commander of all the Mormon state's military forces, and he's like the right-hand man of Supreme Acolyte Josiah, Supreme Acolyte Mordecai. He's got his plate carrier on, like his armor. He's got his AK, and he's got a grenade. Look at all the detail I put into the weapon. Yep. He's called the Commander of the Faithful because he's the second in command of the entire Council of Elders, which is like all the different acolytes that came together to form the Council of Elders, which is like the leadership of the Mormon state. But they all became like sub-commanders of the different Mormon state forces. Yeah, it is kind of funny, man. Yeah, I find it humorous that religious kooks like this really exist. They do. They really do. Like to think, like to believe they don't is crazy, because like, yeah, yeah, I made Mordecai hardcore. Like he's like Mullah Omar in Afghanistan, the religious cleric that personally took out 20 Soviet tanks in the Soviet-Afghan war with a rocket-propelled grenade. No, seriously, if you go read about his history about Mullah Omar, the Taliban leader, he seriously took out 20 tanks single-handedly with a rocket-propelled grenade. But he lost his eye in Afghanistan in combat, so he became the one-eyed mullah. When you see pictures of him, he's got an eye patch and everything. He got shrapnel in his eye. But he was the one that created the Taliban. He ruled it for a long time. But he was a warrior. He was like a warrior priest. Well, he was called a mullah, but he was like a warrior mullah. And he went around Afghanistan with his group and he fought the Soviet troops there. Like, they were fanatical. That's how I sort of modeled the Mormon state. I modeled them after ISIS. You know who they are. ISIS is the ones in Syria. Well, I modeled them off of that, but I also, like the Mormon state, how they call themselves the Islamic State. Well, I made the Mormon state. And they're also modeled. I modeled Supreme Acolyte Josiah. I modeled him off of Mullah Muhammad Omar, but his Council of Elders is sort of like the council that ruled the Taliban in Afghanistan. But the whole group itself is actually modeled off of the ISIS in Syria. But the leaders are modeled off of the Taliban. And then you have the regime. You have their little corporation flag with the gold fringing. See, they got gold fringing on it. Then you got the shadowy elites in the background, and they're holding their marionette strings, and you got like the leadership of the regime on it. That could be like the Senate or whoever, And they want to institute their Great Reset, but it ends up backfiring because then they ended up biting off more than they can chew. And then they ended up weakening their own power base so badly that China and Russia just crush it without any opposition whatsoever. But yeah, then you have the Free American Army leader. This is their symbol. It's a eagle dropping 2 hand grenades. And you got General Mathis here. He's a 3-star general. He's the lieutenant general that commands the entire Army Reserve. He's the one that established the junta and started the coup. The one that happened in the Cap, not the one the NSRF did in the Midwest, but the one that happened in the Cap. This is a different faction than the NSRF. This is actually a decent faction. They treat their prisoners humanely. They want to reinstitute the Constitution. But when Texas and Florida leave and other people want to do their own thing, they don't want anything to do with this guy. So they all end up fighting each other anyway. But yeah, when you have stuff like that going on, you guys, I mean, like, I modeled this stuff off of reality. Like, real stuff, real stats, real figures, real capabilities, real things. I mean, can you imagine it? This nation has, 30 million hunters, 7 million combat veterans from the last 2 conflicts. About 5 million of them can probably actually still shoulder a weapon and fight. They have experience, combat experience. They were from the old army, too. They're not from the new woke-tard army. I'm talking about people with real experience, real training. Same with the 20 million other veterans that are there. So we got 20 million regular veterans from the old army that had the training. They may not have been to combat, but they had the training, so they're combat effective. Then you had the combat experienced soldiers, which I'm one of them. I've been in combat. I mean, I have experience. But you have 7 million of us. So imagine some of them joining factions. I wouldn't join a faction. I would be neutral because I believe in self-defense and self-defense only. You join one of these factions, you're probably going to get butchered because everybody's going to be slaughtering each other, like in Syria. But anyways, you have all these factors that people don't even think about. People don't think about this stuff. People don't realize how many crazies are out there, too, like Kaczynskis and McVeighs and just all these kooks and nut jobs that are out there that could do so much damage. They would join factions. You would have computer hackers that would mess with systems, and, you would have things getting destroyed that people depend on, like infrastructure. You'd have power becoming patchy, like in a third world nation where you'd have rotating brownouts in most areas because of the power plant situation. Now, like if Texas left, it would be in the best position to secede because it has its own power grid, and it still has coal plants it could even restart up that have actually the infrastructure's still in place. They just shut them down. So they could actually keep their power grid in a semi-decent state. They would have just enough fuel because they produce just enough that they could actually do subsistence trading, meaning they can trade enough to keep themselves barely afloat. They can do very, 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 very limited military actions and offensives, and that's it. That's all they can do. But they're in the best position to leave because they have the entire reserve fleet off of Beaumont, tankers for oil and barges for trade that they can commandeer and use for their own country when Texas becomes a nation. They also have $1 billion or more. By now it's probably more because when that information came out, it was like 5 years ago. So by now they probably have over $1 billion worth of gold that they can use along with their oil to back their currency, sort of like Russia did a commodities-based ruble. Well, Texas can do a commodities-based Texas dollar, and that's sort of like what I did in my scenario for the economic part. I had Texas using their gold and oil and commodities to keep their money more valuable. Now, the regime is still using the crashed central bank currency, and they try to institute the digital one in their areas of control, but it's a joke. It's a flop. They have nothing to back it. They have no resources. They can hardly maintain any sort of a military. All they have to do is all they can do is recruit woke militias, like woke militias, like BLM, Antifa to fight for them, like mentally ill people basically, and people that don't know what bathroom to use, stuff like that. That's all they can do, and they can recruit these third world foreigners from places like
Somalia and Sudan and parts of Ukraine and whatever, whoever they took in, they can recruit them from refugee centers. They will be the most undisciplined, most untrained, most combat ineffective forces that ever existed. And guess what they'll be used for? They'll be used for human wave assaults, sort of like how Iran did that in the Iran-Iraq war against Saddam's military. They did human wave assaults so that they could save their actual military for the real fighting and the real offensives, because they needed human wave assaults to like wear down the Iraqi lines, because Iraq and Iran fought a very long, very brutal, very bloody war that ended up being like a stalemate anyway. No, like basically everybody lost, because neither side would budge. One was a religious, theocratic, fanatical nation, which was Iran, and the other was like an evil, secular, humanist Ba'ath Party regime, which is pro-Arab nationalism and pro-Arab socialism. But they shit on humanity. Saddam abused his people so bad that they were afraid to complain about anything. Like, that's how scared they were of that dude. Like, even when Saddam was taken down, they were still scared of him. Even when he was gone, when he was no longer in charge, they still feared that man. If people said the name Saddam for years after he was gone, they would get a scared look on their faces, and that's not a joke. So yeah, secular humanism shits on humanity, whether it's Ba'ath Party regimes, whether it's the CCP of China, whether it's Nazism, all the isms, fascism, communism, ultranationalism, all the isms are secular humanism, and they all shit on humanity. So yeah, I don't know what's worse, a theocratic regime like Iran or like the Mormon state or the Taliban. I don't know if they're worse, or the secular humanists, but they're both pretty evil. And in my scenario, one of the first battles that I've already shown in my second video, which is in the playlist, my internal conflict playlist, my Syrian-style civil conflict playlist, second American civil conflict, rather. In that playlist, the final battle that was shown in the second part was the almost apocalyptic, titanic struggle between the two biggest factions on the map. Well, two of the two biggest, I should say, the biggest being the NSRF and the fourth biggest being the Mormon state. But they fought such a bloody battle, and they all rushed as many troops as they could to that battle, that like over 100,000 ended up being slaughtered in total. It was a horrible battle. The NSRF ended up using a Globemaster, a C-17, and they rolled barrel munitions that they created out the back of it onto the Mormon state lines, like in their rear areas where they were trying to assemble their troops. They flew over the Globemaster, lit a bunch of barrel munitions, rolled them out the back. And barrel munitions were used in Yugoslavia, in the Syrian Civil War. They're nasty weapons. They're homemade, but they're nasty. They do a lot of damage. And then the Mormon state retaliated by driving suicide trucks into the front lines of the NSRF and blasted huge craters and killed a bunch of them. So it was an ugly, ugly, titanic struggle between the brutal, fanatical, ultra-nationalist secular humanists and the equally brutal, fanatical, religious kooks and nuts of the Mormon state, the theocratic, psychopaths. So it was a titanic battle. The entire internal conflict was an ugly, deadly, brutal conflict. And when you have different factions obtaining weapons of mass destruction, anything becomes possible. That's when you need to have your gas masks and if the worst comes to worst, you need at least like a rubber raincoat and some rubber pants and things like that you can make airtight. Because nerve agent, once it touches your skin, it'll start to affect your central nervous system, and you'll die a horrible, suffocating death because your lungs will stop working and you'll literally just die. You have to have like an atropine injector, and you have to inject yourself within like the first 2 seconds, or you're a goner in any type of nerve agent attack. So when the Iraqis did that in the Iran-Iraq war, when they cut off the Iranians, the 200,000 of them in the Al-Faw Peninsula, and they fired their VX shells and they dropped their VX munitions from planes and sprayed them and everything, like they gassed 200,000 of them in a single day. Like 200,000 died from VX, and the Iranians didn't really have proper nuclear, biological, or chemical suits or anything, so they died immediately. And the Iraqis collected their helmets when they collected the dead,
and they put the helmets in the parade field in Baghdad, where, like, in front of the presidential palace, where the cross scimitars are that the Iraqi troops used to march under in front of Saddam. Yeah, they put the helmets cascading out of it like a celebration of their death by gassing. And he also gassed the Kurds. So the NSRF is brutal in my scenario. They use a lot of nerve agents because they got the Bluegrass Kentucky stockpile. Think about it. All these places in an internal conflict are going to be raided. Armories are going to be raided for all the weapons. Places that store weapons of mass destruction, they're going to be captured and raided. And all these people are going to go nuts when they get these weapons. This place, when it rips itself apart, all these things will become possible, and they'll likely happen, and a lot of people are going to die. So when I make these scenarios, it's to help you all get through it. So that's why I do what I do. I don't do this just to entertain people. This shit is not entertainment. This shit is meant to be educational. And I get very passionate about that. So, I don't think shit is a curse word. It's just a synonym of excrement or feces. So it's not it's not no bad word to me. Now, the F-bomb, that's a little different, but anyway, the point is that I take this very serious. There's been times where I've wanted to straight up quit doing this, but I feel like God pulls me into it. Like God makes me come back and keep doing this work so that I can help people, so that I can shatter narratives, I can shatter misconceptions about how armies work and what they can and can't do, and how things really work from a mechanical standpoint, from a logical, rational, mechanical standpoint, based on numbers, based on math, based on stats, figures, facts, capabilities, not based on fantasy fairy tales like so many different content creators put out that don't know what the hell they're talking about when it comes to like military stuff. They don't look at the resources that are available. They don't do all this extra shit that I'm doing. I'm doing this shit to like make it clear to people that how things work mechanically and why and how. Armies just can't get up and do. They don't have like a genie where they just wish for resources and logistics and it all just appears, where they can wish for transportation that works and it all just appears. Shit happens, like trucks break down, you have to replace parts. You have to pull packs, which is pulling the engine blocks and replacing the engine or fixing parts in the engine. Or you lose a tire, you got to get a new tire. Or you throw a track if it's a tracked vehicle, and that's a nightmare to put back on, because I said in another stream that I've already had to do that on my Paladin. I was in field artillery. I got used a lot like infantry in Iraq because we're a combat arms MOS. That's our secondary training is infantry. Same with tankers. We and they can be used like infantry since we're all in the combat arms category. But anyways, when we were on training, we threw track once, and we had to put that back on. Oh, man, if you talk about work, that was some work. Took the whole crew track, or your track gets damaged bad enough, you don't have a replacement for it. You don't have a link you can put in, like a new link, or the whole thing's damaged. Guess what? You're stuck. You're stranded. And if that happens in the middle of battle, if you don't ditch that vehicle, you're gone. You're gone. People don't understand this stuff. They don't think about the smallest, last, tiniest details of these things. There's a lot that goes into this stuff, you guys. I put a lot of effort and energy into this. I just want people to know that. That's the purpose of this, is to help people to survive. I do it through hypotheticals, through hypothetical scenarios, but I use the hypotheticals because I calculate all the realistic data when I make these. When I come up with these factions, I'm basing that off of real factors that exist in our real world, in our real time, and I'm using that to create these things. Same with the armies, what their capabilities are, what the vehicles they have are, what equipment they have, what they can do with it, so on and so forth, what logistics they have. It takes a lot to make this stuff. So that's the purpose of this. I just wanted to make this abundantly clear while I still was awake and I felt like talking about it. Again, I hadn't had the best night tonight, but that's personal stuff, so I'm going to leave that to myself. But aside from that, I just felt it was important to educate people. This channel is an education channel. It's an education channel only. It's not entertainment. If you're here for entertainment, then get lost, because that ain't what this is about. Go. I don't want people here if they're here for entertainment. This is about real life stuff. I want people that are serious about their prepping and their preparedness, their emergency planning. I don't want people making plans based on fantasies and fairy tales. I want people making plans and realistic preparations based on real life stuff, reality, not fantasy, but reality. You know, I explained everything. I wish people would understand it all by now. You know, people keep reverting back to the psyops and all the other stuff and getting brainwashed and confused by it. No, it's not the way it is. Smith Munt is gone. You can be propagandized. They're trying to agitate people, but that's all going to backfire on them. I've been trying to tell people that this is the result of it. They're going to split up the country. They're going to break it up because factions will arise, fill the power vacuum, and they'll rip this place to shreds. And then the Eastern elites, the Chinese CCP, the Russian political oligarchy, and all their allies are going to come and scramble for their piece of the pie. They're already inside the nation as per the Chinese civil-military fusion policy on CCP regime properties that they've bought over the last 20-plus years. They've owned our ports. They've been able to import their Club K caliber cruise missiles. I've shown that in my documentaries. And beyond that, some of my earliest work has that information in it. What they're capable of, the range on them, what they can do. They're supersonic. They can fit 4 of them per 2. I have all that stuff way back, you guys. If you guys look at all my old material, you'll really learn things. You know, I mean, I just wish people would stop, you know, looking at all the stuff that ain't being beneficial. You know, I mean, I'm serious about that. There's a lot of nonsense out there. People have to use discernment. So I'm trying to help people. I put a lot of effort into this. I wish people would watch it, but it seems like, you know, it's boring to some people. Well, it's their loss. It's their loss. My blood ain't on their hands. Or their blood ain't on my hands. Sorry, it's late, y'all. I'm getting tired. Anyway, y'all have a blessed day. I just wanted to show some of, you know, what went into all this, the making of it, basically. And the other one, because I showed the other maps for the invasion one. But y'all be blessed. Y'all have a good night.